Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the Humanities Center. We continue today our exploration of the forest by thinking more about the forest's place in the human imagination, and to offer their reflections on this theme, we have with us three of my very favourite faculty members from. I say that to everybody.
Okay.
But no, really, three fantastic faculty members from USD's College of Arts and Sciences. The far end here, Ryan Abrecht gained his PhD from UC Santa Barbara and is associate professor in the Department of History. He's a specialist in ancient Mediterranean history and culture, with a particular emphasis on the history of the Roman Empire. Dr. Abrecht is a great friend of the Humanities Center and has offered some of our most fascinating seminar classes for students, including the brilliantly titled Atoms, Pleasure and Death, and the even more brilliantly titled How to Get Yourself Killed in Antiquity. Lisa Smith was educated here at the University of San Diego, where she received her master's in English and has taught in the Department of English for over 30 years. That's not true. Her specialisms lie in the areas of contemporary fiction, literature for children and adolescents, the Bildungsroman, and weird and uncanny fiction. Among the enormous range of classes she has taught are courses especially designed for future educators. And Mark Woods earned his PhD from the University of Colorado Boulder and is professor and chair in the Department of Philosophy. His principal and overlapping areas of research are environmental philosophy and issues of war and peace, topics he regularly teaches at USD. His focus on the concept of wilderness, about which he'll be talking today, earned its fullest expression in his 2017 book, Rethinking Wilderness. Before training as a philosopher, Dr. Woods served in the United States Marine Corps. The format today is a little bit different because Professor Woods has teaching duties, a particular hazard of this job, which are sort of starting now. So he's taken time out of his busy teaching class, thank you very much for that, to speak to us. And then we'll take just a couple of minutes of questions on Dr. Woods' presentation before moving on to our other two speakers. Then there'll be a Q&A about their work at the end. This is a break from tradition that makes me terribly nervous. But anyway, our three speakers today will be talking to us on aspects of the imagined forest. So please give a very warm welcome to Mark Woods, Lisa Smith, Ryan Abrecht.
Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about wilderness, but my wife challenged me to make a PowerPoint presentation with no text. So I made a PowerPoint presentation with no text. It's rather short, but I'm going to be talking about the imagined forest, and my name is Mark Woods. So, okay, all right. Here, what do I point? Which way do I point this? The wrong way. Okay, so I start with this, a map. It's obviously a map of the United States. What are you looking at with all these little splotches on the map? Does anyone know? U.S. National Forest. Good. Has anyone ever been to a U.S. National Forest? How many of you? What did you do in a U.S. National Forest? Anybody? Hiking, camp? Anything else? Swim? Ski? Okay. Does anyone know what U.S. National Forests are for? What their purpose is? Sorry, everybody spoke at once. One person. Logging, okay. But it sounds like none of you logged in a national forest. So what else are they for?
Hunting.
For hunting. Has anybody hunted in a national forest? Okay, so what else? Are they for something else? Recreation, very good. Are they for anything else? Watershed. For anything else? You're not allowed to speak, Ron. Anything, you know too much. Anything else?
Can you put houses there? And people have houses in the national forest.
Yeah, there are private inholdings. There's actually private inholdings in national parks, too. Yes, and all kinds of public lands. Yes, very good. Does anybody know when they came into existence?
Teddy Roosevelt.
Actually, slightly before Teddy Roosevelt in 1897. Does anybody know how many national forests there are? A wild guess?
50.
50? Good guess, Michelle. There's actually 154. And not on the map. There's actually national grasslands, which is kind of odd. They're grasslands. And there's 20 of those which are not on the map. They're in 44 states, Puerto Rico, and not on the map, the Virgin Islands. They actually comprise 9% of the landmass of the United States. So they're quite significant. So I'm actually going to talk about imagining the national forests. And I asked you the question, what are the national forests for? Remember that question because we are going to return to it at the end of this. Okay, the national forests, I could go into a lot of history, but the national forests came out of a series of decisions and acts that go back to 1876 and culminate in 1897 with the creation of the National Forests, and the Division of Forestry actually becomes the United States Forest Service in 1905. Cleveland National Forest, has anybody been to the Cleveland National Forest? It's not too far, depending on traffic, about an hour, hour and a half from here. This is Gifford Pinchot. He was the first head of the National Forest, and he is best known as a conservationist utilitarian. He argued that the national forest should be managed to provide for the greatest good for the greatest number of people for the longest time. So he is known as a champion of conservation. Okay, he is often contrasted, here he is over here on the far left, he's often contrasted with this guy right here, John Muir, standing with President Theodore Roosevelt in Yosemite National Park. There was a debate between them. Their lives overlapped for a short period of time. And John Muir was a champion of national parks. The national parks first came into existence in 1872 with Yellowstone National Park. And there were many national parks that came into existence at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. Gifford Pinchot tripled the U.S. National Forest when he was head of the National Forest. And there's a debate that's often taught, I don't know if you still teach in environmental studies, Michelle, between that John Muir was about preservation and he championed the national parks, and Gifford Pinchot was about conservation and he championed the national forest. That debate is largely mistaken, I'm going to argue. And yes, okay. So these two people contrast each other. At the time, the national parks many are coming into existence, many more national forests coming into existence, and there was tension between the National Park Service, which actually came into existence in 1916, and the U.S. National Forest Service. And there was tension between the two of them. There was questions about what are the national forests for, what are the national parks for. And in 1897, when the Organic Act that helped establish the national forest came into existence, the forests were managed for 7 purposes. One was logging, another was for watershed protection, another was for forest protection, and there were 4 secondary purposes: hard rock mining, mineral development, grazing, and water diversion projects. The national parks supposedly to preserve nature. And so this is the tension between them, but the tension was a little misguided. Auto camping. After World War I, many Americans took to auto camping, about 10 to 15 million Americans in the 1920s. That's about 10 to 15% of the U.S. population. And we have Yellowstone National Park, and we have the Custer National Forest. Does anybody know which is which on here? Which is Yellowstone and which is the Custer National Forest? Yellowstone on the right. Nope. I tried to trick you with that one. Yes. Yes, this is people fishing in Yellowstone National Park. This is actually Custer National Forest. This is actually the highest mountain in Montana, Granite Peak, at I think it's 12,800 and some feet, right on the northern edge of Yellowstone National Park. So the national forests aren't all forests, and many people envision Yellowstone National Park has just geysers and wildlife and the like. So yes, I tried to trick you with that one. Two famous people in the National Forest Service who later became famous and important for national wilderness preservation, and I'll talk about why I'm talking about wilderness here in a moment, were these two people, Robert Marshall, otherwise known as Bob Marshall, and Aldo Leopold. Bob Marshall worked for the National Forest Service in the 1920s and the 1930s. Aldo Leopold worked for the Forest Service in the 1910s and the 1920s. They both were foresters. Leopold went on to become a more famous person. Many people have not heard of Marshall, but many people have heard of Leopold. He went on in Wisconsin and he became a professor of wildlife biology, worked in ecological restoration, and they both started the Wilderness Society in 1934. Marshall actually funded it. And they championed wilderness preservation at the time. The Forest Service, following the lead of this guy, Aldo Leopold, in the late 1920s, began to actually set aside land for preservation with a number of regulations. And at the end of the 1930s, that land was given more permanent protection following the lead of this guy, Marshall. In 1923, the Secretary of Agriculture, this is where the Forest Service is housed, actually made a cabinet-level decision to protect this land up here, which was permanently protected with Congress with the Shipstead-Nolan Act of 1930, this is the Superior National Forest in northern Minnesota, which became the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, which is the most heavily visited wilderness area in the United States. About 200,000 people a year canoe through that. And this guy asked that this area in New Mexico, the Gila, be preserved as wilderness in 1922. And his submission was lost for 2 years in public records, and in 1924, the Forest Service actually designated this as a wilderness area. The point I'm trying to make is the national forests are actually preserving land as wilderness, not the national parks. And this is important because what's going on in the national parks? Well, this kind of stuff. The national parks are doing what's called windshield wilderness. So we have here, I don't know if anybody's been to Glacier National Park, this is the going to the Sun Road, going up here, crosses the Continental Divide. This is what camping looked like in Yosemite National Park in the early 20th century. It doesn't look like anything like that now. A lot of development of scenic turnouts and the like. This is in the Grand Teton National Park. This is the tree that fell over 1960s, I think. This is the tree you could drive a car through. And over here is the Old Faithful Lodge in Yellowstone National Park being put in. The Wilderness Society came into existence in 1934, and many people thought the Wilderness Society was about fighting hunting, grazing, logging, mining, these kinds of things. The Wilderness Society largely came into existence because they didn't like what was happening in the national parks. They called this windshield wilderness. So this is a bit of an irony that later Edward Abbey called this industrial tourism. And so they largely came into existence to champion wilderness, and they didn't like what the National Park Service was doing. They said this was not preserving wilderness, that this was punching roads all through the national parks did not preserve wilderness. Howard Zahniser, the president of the Wilderness Society, championed wilderness preservation, and in 1964, here's President Johnson, September 1964, signing the Wilderness Act, which designated 54 wilderness areas, all of them in national forests. And this was the birth of the National Wilderness Preservation System, which gave federal protection to wilderness. Later, the National Park Service was obligated to inventory their lands for wilderness protection. They fought against it. They didn't want to designate wilderness in national parks. Later, there was wilderness designated in national wildlife refuges and later in Bureau of Land Management lands. So again, the point I'm trying to make here is that the national forests were the champions of wilderness. In 1976, the National Forest Management Act decreed what the national forests are for. And the national forests are for 9 uses today. And some of you threw these out when I asked what are national forests for. They're for logging, hard rock mining, mineral development, grazing, watershed protection, water diversion projects. This is actually in the Angeles National Forest above Los Angeles. Outdoor recreation, which doesn't have to be motorized. It could be things like backpacking and hiking and riding a horse or hand gliding and the like. Wildlife conservation, sometimes hunted, sometimes not, and wilderness preservation. But the National Forest Service is mandated to do what is called multiple use sustained yield to manage the national forest, and all of these are not compatible. In the 1980s, the National Forest began cutting national forests at an accelerated rate, especially with a lot of clear cutting like that. Who was president of the United States in the 1980s? This guy, Ronald Reagan, not known for his environmental policies to protect nature. In the 1980s, this guy over here, who you probably haven't heard of, Randall O'Toole, was a public policy analyst. He worked with environmental groups opposed to the way the Forest Service would cut down forests for logging companies, and the Forest Service would actually lose money because the Forest Service would build roads, they would subsidize the cuts, and these would be below-cost timber sales. And he thought this is a bad way, and the Forest Service should actually be making money off of forests, not losing money. He wrote a book in 1988 called Reforming the Forest Service, and he argued that free market solutions were better than government management for the national forests. And he said basically end government regulation of national forests and essentially privatize the national forests. What became very popular at this time, it was popular before this time, and it's been even more popular today, is what's called free market environmentalism, or more broadly, neoliberal economics. Essentially, environmental problems are not environmental problems, they're economic problems. So reinterpret environmental problems as strictly as problems of economics, and you solve environmental problems with economics. And so I'm trying to illustrate this here. I don't know if that does a real good job. But essentially, you need to privatize the environment as much as possible. One basic problem is there's no private property rights that exist for things like national forests or national parks or beaches, state beaches and the like. This is very much in line with, politically, with certain forms, most forms of libertarianism. So privatize the environment as much as possible. If you don't like the way the Cleveland National Forest is being managed, buy it. And you'll ideally try to manage it better because you'll own the forest. It doesn't always work like that. If you don't like the way the government is trying to protect an endangered species, buy the species. And reinterpret environmental problems has economic problems. And put the environment into the free market, and that is the way to solve environmental problems. The way that is used mostly today doesn't work, period. So this is what takes off in the 1980s. Many of you might have heard of this. And the president's page, yes. In 1999, President Clinton instructed the Forest Service to inventory their lands that were roadless lands that were not already designated as wilderness. There were actually a lot of lands that, in fact, about a third of the national forests at the end of in 1999 were roadless, but were not designated as wilderness areas. And at the time, the National Forest Service had about 386,000 miles of roads in the national forests. There's actually more roads in the national forest today. And the Forest Service in 2001 adopted what's called the roadless area conservation rule, where they're not going to, with these a third of the national forests that are already not designated as protected federal wilderness areas, they're going to leave them alone. and maybe someday they'll get designated as wilderness areas. But ideally, there's going to be no roads punched into them, no logging, and the like. So they adopted that rule in 2001. President George W. Bush tried to rescind that rule when he was president. Through a number of legal means, he lost in the courts. Consistently, environmental groups fought against him in the courts, and the environmental groups won again and again. President Obama championed the roadless rule, and the roadless rule remained in place. President Trump repealed the roadless rule for the Tongass National Forest. This is the largest national forest in the United States. It's in Alaska. It's 18 or 19 million acres. And it was going to be a symbolic victory, take the largest national forest and repeal the roadless rule and punch roads into it and log it. That got held up, and President Biden now restored the roadless rule for the Tongass National Forest. I think you can see a pattern of what's going on here. Okay, what's going on. And that brings me back to the beginning, to the map. So the national forests do not remain static. Ecological change is normal. We are in the beginning of a mass species extinction event with what sometimes is called the Great Climate Shuffle with species. We are experiencing climate change, which is going to radically change the composition of the national forests. Politics, as you can see from the last slide, determines in part what's going on with the national forest. I picked the national forest as a way to take the political temperature of the United States. And I focused deliberately on wilderness because wilderness lands are areas that are deliberately not managed and not humanized by modern industrial humans. And I've written a book about wilderness, and I think the national forests are important, especially given all the roadless lands left in the national forests. And many people just see the national forest as a great place to go camp, or a great place to go hunting, or a great place to go backpacking or something like this. But I think if we look at the slightly over about 120 years of the national forest, there's a lot of important history here. And I think one important thing to think about, to imagine in the future, is what do we want the national forest to be in the United States? And I think this is important for the United States. I think this is important for thinking about our relationship to nature and the like. So I have no idea how much time I took, but thank you.
Hi, I'm really happy to be here. Thank you, Brian, for inviting me. I am now going to depart wildly from Mark. For those of you who like facts and figures, I don't have them. There's no real forest here. This is what you're going to get. So, as Brian mentioned, I teach children's lit, and in children's literature there are lots of forests. And so it was pretty hard for me to narrow it down, but I thought that I would just deal with fairy tales because that's a particular interest of mine, and as anybody who's ever read one knows, there are forests everywhere. I want to note really quickly about fairy tales that they were never told or written down or initially for children. They were for the amusement of everybody. Children didn't really exist in the way that you know them before the 19th century. They were just sort of short people that you hoped got through adulthood. And if they heard them, they heard them. Now they've come to sort of be stuck in the children's lit place. But anyway, they're a little bit like cartoons. The older you get, the more you see in them, the more depth they have. So I've chosen Little Red Riding Hood, there she is, because it is the favorite of all the tales for me. She's my favorite, and I love her. I do, and I'm not alone. Charles Dickens declared that red was his first love. And he also said, if only I could have married her, I would have known eternal bliss. Wow. He really did, he said that. This story now is having more of a moment than I think it's ever had. It has legions of fans. If you go to Etsy or Pinterest or Reddit or any of these places, you're going to be shocked. The amount of Red Riding Hood merchandise and stuff is crazy. So it's a story for the moment, which I think is particularly interesting, and that is part of the reason I picked it. There's fan fiction, fan illustrations. There's a whole branch of Japanese anime that is dedicated to Red Riding Hood. They love her in Japan. I'm not really sure why. There is a robust industry of Red Riding Hood pornography. If only Charles Dickinson had the internet, he really would have known bliss. That would have been good for him. So the reason that I've chosen it also, and the reason I think it's having a moment, is it's really a girl's story. It's in all those sites that I just, not all of them, but Pinterest and Etsy certainly, 99% female driven. It's a story for girls to grow up on. On its surface, it is a cautionary tale. Walk properly and do not go off the road, the Grimms tell us. It's full of morals and lessons that tell girls and later women how to navigate the road of sexual propriety so that you can go from mother's house to granny's house, from youth to old age, through the forest, safely and acceptably. That's the important word there, acceptably. It's a sexual parable. In this story, the forest, unlike a lot of fairy tales, it's not really that scary. Here it is, but I've got other illustrations, because it's a forest. The mother never worries about her getting lost in the forest. She doesn't worry about getting lost in the forest. She never expresses fear. It's a short journey. Mother, granny, path. Presumably she's done it before. She's carrying food. It's just not going to last that long. Which brings us to the wolf. What this forest has is wolves, or a wolf, probably more than one. It also has, in various tellings, woodcutters and hunters. This is the arena of the male. Right? We've got seducers and saviors here. There are no witches in this particular. She's the lone girl that walks through here. Here we see her in her bright red cape. These are pretty. These are contemporary, unattributed. They're all over the internet. I just stole them, because everybody else does. So it makes sense that this journey through the woods represents the path or the role of sexuality in a female life. Sex in the distant past of these stories, before contraceptives, equaled pregnancy. Pregnancy often equaled death. Here is the girl. We see her in her bright red cloak. Angela Carter, the British writer who, in her story, short story called The Company of Wolves, she calls the cape or the cloak the color of poppies, the color of sacrifices, the color of her menses. She's the color of a target. She's advertising her sexual ripeness. And this is a Japanese anime. You can see that it's made explicit, the blood not only of menstruation, but also of her possible death at the hands of the wolf. So this forest, with its daring wolf and its path, it's no wonder that it looms large in the female imagination. These are contemporary also. The forest in these is just nothing but the wolf, basically. You can see that his legs and here. They're both in motion. They're very interesting. I really like these. There's a lot like this. This doesn't really fit, but I put it in here because I like it. This is 1953 Max Factor ad for Red Riding Hood red lipstick. It's a new red, a ripe young red. Here, you can see looks like John Hamm. This is very Mad Men kind of guys in the forest. But what's important here is that they're fine. They're good guys, right? They're smiley. She's seductive. She's doing it on purpose. She's in charge, and that's important. So to where I'm going. So there's another story that is underneath the original story, maybe, or next to it, whatever direction you like to think about these things. And that's the story, and this is why I've got this stuck in here sort of awkwardly, is the story of female desire and the expression or repression of that. Girls are also wolfy. Just here to tell you that. They're also voracious. They can be. What if you're a daughter who wants to go off the path? You hear the story and you're like, no, yeah. What if you don't want to be like your mother or your grandmother? What if you want to forge a new path that isn't like either of them? What if you, like the wolf, can be more than one thing? What if you want to meet a wolf? Maybe you like motorcycles. It's fine, right? So Bruno Bettelheim, and this is for Brian, the child psychologist and Freudian, He says in his Uses of Enchantment, which is a really very interesting book on fairy tales, he says that the choice Red Riding Hood must take or must make is that between the pleasure principle and the reality principle. In some tellings, actually, of the story, she meets him on a fork in the road, and she has to choose where she's going to go. In the same vein, sort of, but more sort of plainly, we have the American writer Juna Barnes, who says, children know us something they can't tell. They like Red Riding Hood and the wolf in bed. And what she means and what he means, I think they're both sort of looking at, they're sort of acknowledging the inchoate sexual interests that children have in adult sexuality. Barnes, particularly, it is the naughtiness of the story, the transgression that is attractive about it. And this makes sense as you start looking at the stories. The wolf, as we'll see in later tellings, he's charming. He's handsome. He's well-dressed. And he really wants you. Hard to resist. In Neil Jordan's film, I think it's 1982 maybe, it's an adaptation of The Company of Wolves. Granny, in righteous indignation, says, "What have you done with my granddaughter?" And he says, "Nothing she didn't want." And let me, in case you're mishearing me, let me make that very clear. When he says nothing she didn't want, he's not saying she's asking for it. In the story and in the film, it's extremely clear that she has agency. They want each other. They want to do it. They want to get in bed. So what they have to do is they have to get rid of Granny, who is tradition and repression and history and all those things. So here we have, this is a topsy-turvy doll. This is actually, they're not two dolls, they're one doll. Some of you must have had these, you turn them upside down. Yeah. So it's making clear Wolf and Granny. Some of them, they're three-way. They have all of them in it, so they're pretty good. So there's two versions of the story that I'm going to talk about that I'm fitting into this. One is the Charles Perrault, the French version, which was written down in 1695, and the Grimm version of early 19th century, which is about like 1810-ish. Here is the Perrault version. His wolf is always a dandy, and I'm going to talk about why. He's always really well dressed. Over here, he's wearing sheepskin. He's covering his modesty carefully because he's upright. Here, he's very French court. He's got really beautiful fabric. He's bejeweled. He's groomed. He also covering himself strategically. The important thing in these forests also is you note that there's flowers. It's a very beautiful forest. This isn't dark and dank. And in this one particularly, there's a lot of light, but you can see that the branch has been cut. It hasn't fallen down, and that's important, which means that there is some sort of encroaching civilization or some such thing like that. Both of these girls, she looks a little surprised. There's also woodcutters in this one, which is interesting. She looks surprised. She doesn't really know what to think. This poor girl, she's very confused. So Charles Perrault and his friends are sophisticated people. They're members of the French court. They collect these stories as amusements to tell the court. They like these stories because they are about rustics and their homespun sort of wisdom. They're slumming a little bit, actually. It's a bit like Marie Antoinette and her shepherdess cosplay. So it's a familiar story. You know this story, although actually the Grimm is told more in the US, but you know it. Girl, Granny, path, wolf. When she meets the wolf, he says, "Where are you going?" And she says, "To Granny's." And he says, "Where's that?" And she tells him. She gives him the coordinates. You're just like, girl. He then says, "I know where that is. How about you take that path and I'll take another path and we'll see who gets there first." And she says, "Okay." So, of course, he gets there first. He eats Granny. He puts on the nightie, which is really great. Puts on the nightie and the hat. He gets in bed. She comes in the door and he says to her, no joke, he says to her, "Take off your clothes and get in bed." And she goes, "Okay." And she does. So they engage in the famous call and response that everybody knows about how big his parts are. "Grandmother, what big eyes do you have? Grandmother, what big teeth?" In this version, and I'm not making this up, in this version she says, "Grandmother, what big arms do you have?" And he says, "The better to embrace you with, my dear." So he doesn't do that. He goes, "So I have to do a wolf doing a falsetto." I told these guys back here, I thought about, I should have got Carlton to do this for me. I think that would have been really, really, really good. What big what big arms you have. The better to, I can't do it. The better to embrace you with, he says. And then she says, grandmother, what big legs you have. You're getting really worried about the story at this point, right? And he goes, and he inexplicably says, and this must be a bad translation, he says, the better to run with you. What? Fortunately, they stop. They go back above the waist, and she mentions his big teeth, and he says, the better to eat with, and he does. He eats her. That's it for her. There's no redemption in this story. There's no manly man. She's done. Bye, girl. So Perot, makes zero bones about the fact that this is not about wolves, that this is about wolfy guys and stupid girls. Yeah, it is more than a cautionary tale. It's real. So he and the French court are all giggling about this because they know these guys. And here's his moral. Little girls, this seems, I don't know why I'm doing that in a falsetto. Little girls, this seems to say, never stop upon your way. Never trust a stranger friend. You never know how it will end. As you're pretty, so be wise. Wolves may lurk in every guise. Handsome they may be, and kind. Gay or charming, never mind. Now is then, 'tis simple truth. Sweetest tongue has sharpest tooth. You know what's going to happen to you. This is from the Neil Jordan Company of Wolves film. It's a great film if you've never seen it. It has a fantastic forest in it. It's really great. And he's a guy through the whole thing. Well, that's not true. He does do some sort of weird CGI thing at some point. But anyway, and this comes to the Grimm. This is the famous Gustave Doré etching, I think it is, lithograph, something, Derek, which, etching, yeah. So I love this picture. This is also on the cover of the Bettelheim. I love it because everything about it is good. She looks less frightened and more like, what are you wearing? She's very confused. And the wolf is particularly great if you get up close to him. He looks like, he has that look that dogs have when you put clothes on them. Like he's like slightly embarrassed that he is wearing a nightcap. The whole thing is very strange. I like it a lot though. But anyway, so when the Grimm come across this tale, they don't like this slick dandy guy wolf, seducer of little girls. They think it's unseemly. And they think that maybe she deserves some sort of redemption, maybe a Christian ending. They collected tales, these Grimm guys, because they wanted to show the wisdom and the moral superiority of the German folk. Occasionally, though, they found out that the German folk wasn't quite as moral as they thought they were. And so they cleaned them up. They superimposed Christian morals on the end. They put Bible verses in them, etc. And so here they do. So enter the woodcutter. He's a manly German guy. He has a square jaw. He has a V-shaped body. He is literally a clearer of forests, a bringer of light. He is a savior of old ladies and girls. He saves them from their own stupidity. So in this story, it's just like the Perot one, except at the end, since they've decided to redeem her. So the woodcutter, and I don't really know how he knows this, but he comes running through the door. Here he's got an axe, but in the actual written Grimm version, he doesn't have an axe. Here's what he does. He cuts open the wolf's abdomen with scissors. Not kidding. I don't know. He's got a Swiss Army knife. He does this, right? He cuts it. Out jump Granny and Red, right? They're reborn and new. Maybe we should read that as virgin, right? He then, and this is my favorite part. He then, because he's also got a sewing kit, he sews up the wolf's abdomen. Well, I got it wrong. He fills it with rocks, and then he sews it back up. There's this whole pregnancy thing here you could really deal with if you wanted to. He sews it back up because he's like an obstetrician. The wolf runs outside because rocks. He falls over and dies. I don't know if it's a digestive problem or it's just because he's too heavy. I mean, he's already eaten 2 people. It's a real day for him. So the end of his story, to contrast with the Perot version, is afterwards, all 3 were quite delighted. The hunter skinned the wolf and took the pelt home. The little Cap, who's our girl, however, thought to herself, you will never again leave the path or run into the forest on your own as long as mother forbids it. You notice in this story, in the other one, we've got the scolding Perot, who's like, go off the path, get eaten. They make her voice her own contrition. She had to internalize the lesson. It's very, very important that she does this. So where do we go with this? So in the 20th century, writers and women begin to consider or reconsider this story. They look at the other story, that one that acknowledges that women are also sexual beings, begins to emerge. Sex no longer equals pregnancy. Pregnancy no longer equals death. And you don't have to marry him. We've had the summer of love. It's fine. So here, in 1982, we've got Roald Dahl, who writes the story in verse. This, interestingly, picture is never in American editions. You got to go to the British edition to get this picture. So the story goes along, and when they get to the call and response, at the end she goes, "Grandmother, what a lovely fur coat you have." And he's incensed. He says, "What? No, that's wrong. You're supposed to talk about my teeth so I can eat you." And here, this is what she does. The small girl smiles. One eyelid flickers. She whips a pistol from her knickers. She aims it at the creature's head, and bang, 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 she shoots him dead. We're doing it for ourselves now. Get it? And at the end of the verse, the speaker comes upon her, and she says, "Oh, hello. Please notice my lovely wolfskin coat." Not only has she defeated him, but she's now wearing him, and that's all great. So after that, in 1979, again, Angela Carter and the Company of Wolves, which is such a great story, so I'm using it over. She has a collection called The Bloody Chamber, which is retelling of fairy tales from female perspectives. It's a wonderful book. She gives Red back her agency. She's no longer a little knife. She's a tough country girl. She carries a knife in her basket. She knows how to use it. She follows the Perrault story about the race, who can get to Granny's first, but it's a wager. And Red Riding Hood says, "Well, like, what do I win?" And he says, "A kiss." And so she dawdles. She wants that. She's going to make sure she's there second. He's never, slide do I have here? A rushing ahead of myself, but he's never a wolf. He's always a man. He's like spittle because, he wants her. So there's that. But when they get to the house, she sees the remains of her granny. And since her fear did her no good, she ceased to be afraid. When they get to the whole catechism about bigness, she pulls off his shirt. She pulls off his shirt and she whips off her own chemise. And when he gets to the part where he says, "The better to eat you with," she, quote, laughs in his face, for she knew she was nobody's meat. And the story at the end finds the two of them happily wrapped in each other's arms at the end here. This is the end of the story. See? Sweet and sound she sleeps in Granny's bed between the paws of the tender wolf. This is obviously Japanese anime. Here he's just a pretty boy wearing, wolf stuff. And she's pretty. And they're in each other's arms, and the whole subtext of that, maybe you just want to be with a wolf, and you are a wolf, and he's a wolf, and we're all wolves, and it's all super fun. And what's important here, too, is the Granny's bed. Again, Granny's gone. There's no more of that. There's no more of that sort of history and repression, and he's tender, and everything is very nice about that. And if you think about it, in these stories that take it back in terms of being a story about, a love story, if you read the call and response, which you can read as, "Grandmother, what big eyes you have. The better to see you with." Or you can read it, "Grandmother, what big eyes you have. The better to see you with." It can become it's a foreplay, right? "Grandmother, what big ears you have." It can be that whole back and forth depending on how you decide to read it. So, where are we now in the Red Riding Hood story? Can we, girls, women, can we go off the path safely? Are there still forests? Everybody in this whole series has told us there's no forests. Can we tell wolves? Do we have to choose between the pleasure principle and the reality principle? I think both. So, what does the forest become? Here it is. This is unattributed AI, actually. And here, it's fantastic. You see, I'm not endorsing AI. And here we can see that the forest is now the skyscraper. That's what we now navigate. Red Riding Hood illustrations are full of girls that are fully armed, right? There's a popular T-shirt that says "Fear not" and "Fearless," and she's got all kinds of weaponry. And this one you can see she's totally tooled up. Look at her. She's got a mace. I think she's got a hand grenade. She's got an axe, a knife, and an assault weapon. And she's dressed however she wants to because she can take you. Yeah. This one, you can't see all that well, but she's got these fab boots. She's got a wolf hat, and she's got the wolf's head under her arm. Yeah, we can go into the forest now because we're armed. So we see that, and So when I thought about this, and I thought, well, what is the forest and what is the path that we're on? Is it gone? I don't think it's gone. So when I thought about it, maybe the forest, and women in here know this, maybe the forest is the parking structure at night. Your mother tells you to put your keys between your fingers, because that's, or carry your mace or your noisemaker. Maybe the forest is a trail or a dense park where you go running by yourself. Runner's World magazine tells us, wear a cap, put your hair back in a button so you don't advertise your femaleness from the back. When you go to the club, you never leave by yourself. All women know this. You travel in a pack. Yeah. Maybe here on campus, maybe the path is late at night when you walk from the library to the valley and you're told to call an escort, right? Or drop a pin or whatever. So the problem for women is that even now, we go off the path. We're sexy. We want it. We do it. We do all these sorts of things. But it's still fraught, that there's still danger. The forest and the path and the wolf, maybe they've been transformed, but they're still there, literally and figuratively. I think that we probably have to insist on exploring it still. Maybe like Mark said, in a post-feminist world, we won't have to worry about those things. But not to leave you with just sort of these, I don't think they're dark. I really love these images, but here again is the forest. I meant to show that one earlier, but there it is, very sinister. She looks a little angry. Yeah, she's a little pissed off. She's like, really? Again? Aren't we over this? Did we not? Yeah. But to leave you with something more positive, Red Riding Hood has given us great Halloween costumes. This one is Little Red Riding Ho, in case you didn't know. The other one is Badass in Hood. I love her. If I thought I could have worn that, I would have. She's got, look at her tights. And then here's a happy contemporary girl. She's got a great cape. She's got warmers. She's got things. The path is clear. It's light, and the forest has now been reduced to a kind of abstraction. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That was so fascinating. All right, so I think I got this right. Okay, so I am going to take us further back in time, and I'm conscious of time, so I'll try to move with a purpose. I'm going to talk in this next 20 minutes or so about two imagined forests from the ancient world, so even further back. One, as you see, from Mesopotamia, ancient Sumer, and one from Rome. These are ancient forests that are known to us through literature, and the literature is beautiful and dark and surprising. But I'm going to try to read these stories like a historian, which is with an eye toward the context. What I'm hoping to draw out is an understanding of how the world we know shapes the world that we imagine in these particular times and places. So I'll just get right into it then. Okay, so we'll begin with Mesopotamia, where civilization as we know it began some 6,000, 7,000 years ago. We need to fight about that. This is, of course, the land between the two rivers, right? The Tigris and the Euphrates. It's here, especially down in Sumer, which is basically southeastern Iraq today, that the first cities arose and kind of urban culture as we understand it today. This is a landscape defined by floodplains, marshy reeds, and surrounding deserts, basically. And this is also the place where the first true metropolis, I guess you could say, the city of Uruk, arose and flourished. This is, of course, which gives us Iraq today, the name of this city. This is the first great city that we can really see in human history. Flourishing by 3000 BC with maybe 50,000 people or so, nothing really quite like it before this in time. The first great economic powerhouse, the first great cultural center was this place here, kind of reimagined in a reconstructed image there. Uruk is also the place where the first imagined forest story I'd like to look at today begins. And that story, of course, is the Epic of Gilgamesh. Is Malachi Black here? Thank God. When I was here for his talk, he started talking about Gilgamesh, and I was like, oh no. Because he's very smart, and I was like, be quiet. And thankfully, he didn't stay on it too long, so it's all good. All right, so Gilgamesh. This is the first piece of written literature we have in human history. It's the story of a king of Uruk, who was a historical person, but largely mythologized. A great king, a great hero who is said to be 2/3 god and 1/3 man. The epic has come down to us through several different kind of strains of tradition. It was circulating orally probably for thousands of years. And then we have various versions, a Sumerian version, a Babylonian one, an Akkadian one. They all look like this physically. They're all on cuneiform tablets. They're all fragmentary, but they can be synthesized and editorialized into a single cohesive story. And this was done even in ancient times. So we can read this story today. It's quite remarkable. I can't tell the whole story in here and still stick to time. So I can give you an important setup, and then we'll zoom in on the parts that are relevant to our purpose for the Forest series. So it's important to know about this particular very ancient story that in the beginning our hero encounters and kind of first fights with and then later befriends a wild man, a kind of almost animal-like man named Enkidu. These two, first they fight, then they become friends, and then they immediately decide to go on a great quest together. They want to prove their strength, they want to make their names famous, and it's kind of a boys' expedition to bond, I guess we could say. And that first quest that the hero and his friend undertake in this epic is to the forest. Of course, where else? Right? The epic immediately takes us on a journey to the great cedar forest, which we're told exists at the edges, the extreme edge of the known world, somewhere out there in the west. The epic tells us a few things about this great cedar forest. As I said, we're told it's incredibly distant. Enkidu and Gilgamesh travel for many, many days and nights to reach this far-off place, and we're told that they're kind of larger than life, like each stride covers, 10 miles or something, and even so, it takes them days and days and days to get there. Right? We're told that the cedar forest that they're going to is vast, that the trees are enormously tall, they cover entire mountains, and we're told that the forest is dangerous. Enkidu, who used to be kind of closer to the natural world, tells Gilgamesh that the forest is guarded by a kind of mysterious creature, a monster named Humbaba, who was put there by the gods to protect the cedars and all the animals that live within this kind of enormous sacred forest. So the epic takes us here. Our two heroes are afraid, and as soon as they reach the forest, their fear is kind of mingled in with an almost a kind of sense of wonder. I won't read all these quotes, but in the beginning I think it helps too. They stood there marveling at the forest, observing the height of the cedars, the way in. Where Humbaba, the guardian, came, there was a track, and the paths were in good order. The way was well trodden. They gazed at the cedar mountain, the dwelling of gods and goddesses. On the face of the land, the cedar was in abundance. Sweet was its shade, full of delight. It's a scary place, but also a kind of seductive, shadowy place, It goes on. The poem kind of pauses here, and it's trying, I think, to make the audience really imagine being there. Remember, the audience is a people that live in a very different landscape than this. So I'll just take a second here to show you a little bit more from this passage. The poem talks about the tangled undergrowth, the thick canopy, the trees so entangled that it almost seems like besides the main path, there's no way you could penetrate them. And then it says things like this. The cedar was covered in lumps of resin for 60 cubits high. The sweet sap oozes almost into ravines. And then it pauses to try to engage our inner ear. Through the forest, a bird began to sing, sound like pipes, perhaps. A wood pigeon was moaning, a turtle dove calling in answer. At the call of the stork, the forest exults. At the cry of the francolin, the forest exults in plenty. Monkey mothers sing aloud. A youngster monkey shrieks like a band of musicians and drummers. Daily they bash out a rhythm in the presence of Humbaba, the guardian. It's kind of a beautiful moment, even though we're engaged in this quest to kind of fight a monstrous guardian. The poem wants us to sort of stand there and look at this kind of marvel, right? The sacred forest. So, we can see it, we can smell it, we can hear it. But there's still a guardian. So this creature, Humbaba, who the Epic of Gilgamesh tells us is guarding the great cedar forest at the edge of the known world, is a kind of strange, mysterious creature. He's monstrous and terrifying. This clay mask kind of captures the otherworldliness, but he's also sacred. He was put there, we're told, by the gods to protect the place, and he has, if you want, a job to do. He seems like he might be a personification of kind of the wind that goes through the forest. When he roars, everything shakes, you know? In some versions of the epic, he has 7 sons. He's a family man, I guess. And when they arrive, Enkidu, Gilgamesh's friend, he's at first very hesitant because he kind of knows the dread of this creature, and they sort of hang on the margins. Eventually, they get up their courage. They go in and they engage the guardian of the forest in battle. And we have some depictions of these fights. Enkidu tells his friend to kill the guardian as quickly and decisively as he can. My friend, Humbaba, the guardian of the forest, finish him, slay him, do away with his power. It repeats it for emphasis, the epic. And then his friend tells him, before the great god Enlil learns about this, and the gods are angry with us, we've been sent here on a quest. We have to fulfill our mission, right? Establish an eternal story about how Gilgamesh slew the fearsome Humbaba, guardian of the forest. It's interesting. His friend is appealing, in a sense, to his religious duty, to the greater God who sent them, Enlil, but also to his ego. Establish a story about how you, the great man, slew the guardian of the forest. You know? And that's what they do. They go in, they fight. It's a bloody battle, and Gilgamesh takes his great axe, of course, what else, and he hacks the creature's head off with a series of blows. And in the moment, we're told that the guardian of the forest dies, his death roar shakes the hills, and everything falls silent. All the birds and everything. You can probably guess, I'm not going to quiz you, Mark didn't give enough quizzes, but you can probably guess what they do when the guardian of the forest has been killed. What else would you do when you kill the guardian of the forest? They cut down some trees. They select the best cedars. Enkidu says to his friend, we've cut a lofty cedar whose top touched the heavens. We're going to use this wood to make a great big door. We're going to make a great gate for the wall of our city, Uruk, the wall that separates, if you want, the world of humans and the world of all this other stuff. We're going to float it down the river, let the river Euphrates carry it to the city, let the sanctuary of the great god rejoice, and they ride back home bearing the head of the sacred defender of the forest. Charming, huh? I mean, what to make of this? I think the quest for the cedars to the cedar forest suggests a few things about the hero and this society's telling of what it means to be a hero. He goes on this journey because it's far. It's not like Red Riding Hood's forest. It's the impossibly distant place. He goes there to make a name for himself so that he'll never be forgotten. He goes there to take something valuable back to his city, that beautiful, aromatic, rot-resistant cedar wood, which would be valuable, right? And in some ways, this is also a quest about mortality. He wants to be remembered forever. The Epic of Gilgamesh, I'm sure some of you have encountered it. I know some of you have. It's all about mortality in the end. It begins with this big, hyper-masculine show of force. You know, we're never going to be forgotten. We cut it down. We brought them back, the trees back. And over the course of the epic, our hero realizes that actually that's not sustainable, I guess we might say. His friend Enkidu sickens and dies after offending a goddess. Our hero himself realizes that he also is mortal and will eventually die, and he undertakes, at the end of the story, a final great quest to seek the secret of what else? Of eternal life. I can condense here. That quest takes him even further than he went before, down a dark tunnel at the edge of the world, and he emerges on the other side, really kind of battered and bruised by this point. He emerges, you know, having left the world of the river valley that he knows so well, into a completely bizarre, divine landscape. He comes through, leaving Mesopotamia behind. I just made this with AI. You can do all sorts of weird Canva AI. Just cut it up. It's really weird. But Gilgamesh emerges on his last quest, seeking, you know, in the land of the gods, eternal life, into another forest. But it's a kind of different looking forest than the great cedars which he had conquered. He emerges in the kind of garden of the gods. For those in the back, I'll read this. Before him, the garden of the gods appeared with gem trees of all colors, dazzling to see. There were trees that grew rubies, trees with lapis lazuli flowers, trees that dangled gigantic coral clusters like dates. Everywhere, sparkling on all the branches, were enormous jewels, emeralds, carnelian, sapphires, hematite, diamonds, pearls. Gilgamesh looked up and marveled at it all. He doesn't try to cut the trees down. He doesn't try to take the gems. Strangely, you would think that'd be more valuable than the cedar wood from the earlier part of the story. Maybe you could interpret this as saying that our hero is learning that some things are beyond the grasp of a mortal. Learning that some things are divine and not meant to be touched. And that, of course, is the way that, spoiler, the story ends. He does not find the secret of immortality. He eventually returns empty-handed to Uruk. The poem ends with us looking at the wall of the city, hearing about the great deeds of the legendary, now presumably long dead hero who went on this quest. So, what do you make of this, right? What do you make of this? Why does a story like this emerge, this imagined forest from this culture in this time, this place from ancient Sumer? It's a flat land of rivers and deserts. Aside from date palms, which are referenced in that last clip I just showed you, only reeds grew there in abundance. And I think to a society without forests, who don't have that right in the back of their heads, it doesn't have a dark, closed, mysterious landscape. To them, the imagined forest is the most alien place you could think of. It is beyond the edge of the world. It is completely different from the world that they know. And in it, there's wonderful, precious things, some of which are very dangerous to bring back, some of which are untouchable because they're really not of the human realm. To the Sumerians, the imagined forest was abundant and precious, but also alien, monstrous, dangerous. It was something to be quested for, fought over, maybe cut down and brought back, but also scary. To the historian, the cedar forest is, I'm sure you could probably guess this, almost certainly Lebanon. To the perspective of people living here in what is now southern Iraq, the heights of Lebanon, which are proverbial for their cedar trees, that's still on the flag of Lebanon today, very known from the biblical literature, that's the utmost limit of the world, with an incredibly rare, precious resource. And later Sumerian rulers, historical people we know of, they would consider that kind of high watermark, literally, that you could reach if you were really making a name for yourself. The first great conqueror, this guy called Sargon of Akkad, great name. He tells us in an inscription that he really knew he was a great king when he could wash his weapons in the upper and the lower sea, going beyond the furthest edges, right? He probably knew the Gilgamesh story. So what consumers suggest to us? The forests can be the ultimate alterity if you are from a landscape and a culture like this. All right? Okay, I'm going to shift gears and point us at a different ancient culture, this time from the other end of antiquity, the kind of end of antiquity. And that, of course, is Rome, and I'm only thinking about the Roman Empire now because they're paying me to do it.
Yeah, sure.
All right?
You think about it all the time.
Not as much as you anyway. Okay, so second case study I'll share with you is this. Now we're looking at the Roman world. We're looking at Italy around 2,000 years ago, much closer to us now. 2,000 years ago, the kind of turn of the millennium, that's right around the time that the Roman Republic was being reformed, shall we say, into an imperial system under the first emperor Augustus. The city of Rome here in the middle of Italy, and you're familiar with, I'm sure, at this point is 700 or so years old, the capital of an ever-expanding empire that would continue growing for quite some time. Even though this city had recently been through decades, really, of violent civil war, it was still growing, and it would soon reach maybe a population of 1 million people. That's kind of a high watermark in the century to come. Now, the imagined forest I want to introduce you to from this later ancient culture is mostly coming from Virgil's Aeneid. Some of you may have read this, but for those of you who haven't, this is Rome's national epic. Latin verse poem modeled on the Iliad and the Odyssey, kind of a mashup of the two, written by the poet Virgil in the late 1st century BC. Virgil's job, he's pictured here in a mosaic from North Africa, his job was to try to create kind of a national story about the origins of the Roman people. And he wanted to kind of link the Romans to kind of the much older history of the Greek world, kind of giving Latin-speaking Italians like real cultural cred that they felt that they lacked at this point. So the story in the Aeneid, it tells the story of Aeneas, who was a hero of Troy, who fought against the Greeks and sadly lost, escapes the burning ruin of his city with a small band of survivors, has a kind of very meandering journey around the Mediterranean before finally landing in central Italy, where he meets local people, allies with the local king, marries that king's daughter, fights a small war, and then actually happily settles down and lives happily ever after at the end of the... Well, not really, because it's an unfinished poem, but we're understanding that's happening. Okay, so a cool thing about the Aeneid is that the poet Virgil very deliberately is playing with time a lot in this poem. At several points, the hero, Aeneas, is put in situations that allow the poet's audience to kind of reflect on what Italy was like before Rome existed. And he does this with things like prophecies, dreams, and kind of having the hero stand in places that would become famous and kind of be like, oh, look at this, you know? So I want to call your attention to a couple of those moments and think about how they intersect with the concept of the imagined forest. So in Book 8 of the Aeneid, Aeneas comes to a kind of woodsy, hilly place. He's there to meet a local king, a guy called Evander. He's looking for allies in this war that's kind of brewing, and Evander seems like a promising potential ally. While he's here speaking with Evander, Evander starts telling him what the neighborhood is about. You know, this is this place that I rule. Aeneas has no idea that he's standing in the site that will be eventually the city of Rome, because he's way before that time. He just thinks it's an interesting kind of forest. And this is what Evander tells him about this place. He says, native nymphs and fauns once shared this forest with a race of men born out of flinty oak trees. Primitive, ignorant of yoking oxen, how to gather goods and keep them. Their food came from the trees and savage hunting. Saturn was the first to come, a kingly exile running from high Olympus. This race, untaught and scattered in the high mountains, he brought together under law and called it Latin, since he hid safely in this country. This is a pun on a verb in Latin, which can suggest hiding, right? Under this king, a golden age took place. He ruled the people in peace until slowly a degenerate age came on them with his war frenzy and his ardent greed. Our hero, the one-day founder of the Roman race, comes here and he hears a story about a golden age where people born from oak trees lived in peace under one of the Titans. And then he gives Aeneas a little tour of the spot. He says, oh, look over here, you know, he says he showed him the sacred grove. He showed him Tarpeia's rock in the capital, overgrown with forest brambles. That cliff and woods. He felt a deadly power in that place, we're told. Our hero, he's walking around the site and he feels the hairs raising on the back of his neck. A god, we don't know which, lives in this forest, this leafy hill, the king said. The Arcadians think they see Jove, Jupiter himself, here often shaking his dusky aegis, summoning the storm clouds. The Romans had a word for this concept, this feeling, and maybe you felt it yourself if you are people who like to go into the wilderness. A kind of sacred feeling, a feeling of a divine presence. They called it, the word they used was numen, and the word numinous in English is related to this. A place where like the veil between worlds feels thinner. And if you went to sleep in that grove in the forest, maybe you have a prophetic dream, or maybe you have a waking vision. Here, Aeneas is having a waking vision of the city that will spring from his bloodline. He's standing on the Capitoline Hill in what will be Rome. He just doesn't know it. But our audience, our poet, wants us to think about this used to be a sacred forest. This theme weaves its way through other parts of the Aeneid and through other Roman literature. We're told, for example, Aeneas gets a vision of the future in another portion of the epic. We're told, you see this young man standing with a spear. He is going to be the son that's born to your wife after you die. Silvius, from the Latin word for forest, right? Your son Lavinia will raise him in the forest, and he will become a king and the father of kings. It's strange. When the Romans looked at their city, they thought about a forest. And the story goes on. I'm conscious of time, so I won't read all these, but we're told that Silvius, the hero's kind of woodsy descendant and a line of kings that follow him, rule over a nearby settlement. One day, one of their descendants, a Vestal virgin named Rhea Silvia, goes to a sacred grove, where else, to draw pure water. And she is, of course, what else? Raped by the god Mars, right? Romans love their rape narratives, which is a whole other story. It's a whole other talk. But a woman of the forest goes to a sacred grove, is raped by the god of war, and is told it's fine, because you're going to give birth to two special boys. Who are they? Yeah, everyone knows this story. And as you were talking, I was thinking, what an interesting wolf motif.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah, for
But it's
sure.
kind of flipped
Yeah.
in a way,
Yeah,
right?
totally,
Because
yeah.
here it's the lupa, right, the she-wolf, that raises these two boys who are the sons of the god of war. In a way, it's like they absorb their wild nature from the wolf, but it's the wolf mother,
She doesn't eat them.
and she doesn't eat them. She cares for them. I mean, I can wrap at this point. You see that there's enough here. The founders of Rome have a happy childhood in the forests before, well, one kills the other one, but then they found a great city, and it's fine. Roman history is dark, really dark. Take my class, you want to hear more of this. But I just want to stress that when the Romans thought about their city's origin, they thought of a kind of sacred forest where the gods walked with men. And then when they think about their founders, they thought about kind of young, wild guys in the woods. And that's even still with us, an indie film about Romulus and Remus that just came out, and they're just a bunch of, like, you know, guys who need a bath in the woods. So the question, of course, is why? Why is this the way the Romans imagined the beginning of their time, their great city? The historian would say, I say, it's a profoundly nostalgic vision, imagined forest. To the Romans of Virgil's day, our poet, the great forests of archaic Italy were mostly gone. Rome's growing. The Romans needed lumber for heating, lighting, construction, all sorts of industries, all those nice hot baths, you know? And by his time, most of Italy had been also agriculture, plantation-style agriculture, right? Major deforestation had taken hold. And we're ending up with landscapes that actually look a lot more like Southern California, right outside our window. So I can wrap by saying, to a society that once had forests and cut them down, the forest is kind of the home you can fantasize about returning to, in a way. To people living in an increasingly loud and dirty city, the forest can be a kind of still place where you can still feel the presence of the divine. The moral of the story is, I think for me, different contexts produce different imaginations. Treeless Mesopotamia gives us the imagined forest that is distant, enticing, dangerous. Rome, the forest is kind of recently lost to us, deeply nostalgic, but also comforting in a way, because it reminds us of who we are. In both cases, and I'll close with this, the forest is sacred.